Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Jennifer Splansky-Juster, Executive Director of the Collective Impact Forum at FSG, hosted with Aspen Institute and FSG, and we are delighted to have you here with us today. Thank you for joining. Before we dive into our conversation with today's guests, I'm going to spend a few minutes orienting you to the session. Today's conversation will run for 60 minutes. We have a great session lined up to be a casual learning experience and conversation where we get to hear from wonderful practitioners in the field about their work. We will spend the first part of our time together hosting a discussion with today's guests, and then we will open up to questions from all of you at the end. So actually, at any point during the session, you can use the question box in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to put in questions that we will curate as we go through the conversation. In addition, the session is being recorded, and we will be making that recording available later on today. Please keep an eye out for an email announcing when the recording is up and available. We'll be notifying you of this on the email you used to register with for this webinar. One note, we have loaded the presentation in the handout section, and there's a little tab on the right-hand side of your webinar application with handouts. You can access the slides there if you are interested in doing so. We also have a copy of the article, The Water of Systems Change, which we'll reference during the session, available as a handout. Let's go on to the next slide here. If you're having technical difficulty, you can also use the question box for those kinds of questions, and we'd also encourage you to feel free to share on Twitter or your social media platform of choice about things that you're taking away from today's conversation. So we have an amazing group of presenters joining us today to talk about one of the essential conditions for achieving systems change, building relationships and connections. What I'm going to do right now is briefly introduce our two moderators from the partner host organizations, Hayling and Kim, and they'll introduce our speakers for today as we move through the session. As we mentioned, this is a partnership, today's session between the organization's New Profit and FSG and the Collective Impact Forum, and so we're delighted to have leaders from both organizations moderating the conversation. First, I'm delighted to welcome Hayling Price as one of our co-moderators today. Hayling is an associate director at FSG and is a project team leader with experience in strategy consulting, research, and advocacy in the social sector. In addition to his consulting work, Hayling serves on as FSG's Equity Partnerships Lead, advancing the firm's commitment to social equity through strategic collaboration. Please also welcome with me Kim Syman, who is a managing partner at New Profit. A member of the founding team that created New Profit, Kim helps to spark and advance next-generation strategies for the social impact field. Through the annual gathering of leaders and other platforms, she connects the ideas and people, including social entrepreneurs and their counterparts in government, philanthropy, business, technology, and the media, that can accelerate our nation's collective ability to solve social problems. So with that, I'm going to pass the baton to my colleague Hayling, who will provide some grounding for today's discussion.
Great. Thank you, Jen. Great to be with you all. Excited about the perspectives we'll have on the call again. My name is Hayling Price. I'm an associate director with FSG. Can advance to the next slide. We'll share a little bit about how we're thinking about systems change. So I know many on the line may have joined us in the past, but just so we have some shared language to go into the conversation with. When we talk about systems change, we're really describing the process of shifting the conditions that hold a challenge in place. And in this context, it's often a social or environmental challenge we're holding in place. And I think language we've heard oftentimes is sort of root cause analysis, really getting to the underlying conditions. And we find often in the social sector, there's a lot of conversation about systems change. It can often get a little hand-wavy, a little vague. And what we've sought to do is really add a little bit of rigor around this definition so that we have at least a set of strategies that feel a little more targeted as we seek to shift those underlying conditions. And to that end, we've thought a little bit about a tool for diagnosing, and that is these 6 conditions, which again, you can read more about in the FSG publication, The Water of Systems Change. So we have this device we've been using as a thought experiment and sort of a thought sort of tool, but also in client-facing work to describe the different levers we have to really advance systems change work. So this top layer is what we consider the most explicit, and those are the structural means of advancing systems change. So when we talk about policies, we're really describing what's on the books, and this might be legislation or public policy. It could also be sort of the policies that are sort of governing your organization, but really standards that are codified and kind of governing the way folks operate. Practices are the way that policies are often implemented. As we know, the best laid plans are only as good as sort of execution, and this deals with the way practitioners are really implementing work day to day. So what does it mean to really bring these policies forth with fidelity? And then around resource flows, that's funding, sort of who gets funded for what, and it might also be around human capital, so not just sort of dollars, but also the way we're just thinking about resources broadly to advance the work. So these are the pieces you can really see. It's often easiest to quantify, measure these kinds of impacts as we think about, say, how many folks are enrolled in a new program through a government service, or how many folks we may have served as outputs of a particular kind of social venture, or how many dollars we've raised for this effort. They're the most tangible, but really just the tip of the iceberg, if you will, as we talk about systems change. The next layer, these are the sort of semi-explicit means that go a bit deeper toward transformational change and are a little slippier to identify as we're thinking about the spectrum between what you can really see, what's more granular, and kind of what's underneath the surface. So relationships and connections, which we'll double click on in a second, really relates to what you're seeing today, this conversation about the way we get actors in the system to really align in community with each other and understand what it takes to establish a shared vision and co-create a future together. Power dynamics are often where the equity implications will emerge, although it exists throughout this inverted triangle. We're thinking about sort of who's setting the table, who's empowered to speak, who has kind of veto power. Often this dynamic can flow institutionally through formal authority or informal authority. So it might be that person in your community who's always showing up at the meetings, who is heard, who has presence, who has convening power, but may not have a formal institutional title. So those are the kinds of dynamics that often emerge in our work, and I imagine that will come up a bit today as we explore relationships and connections, but again, a little more slippery as it relates to kind of defining and measuring, but critical as we look to advance systems change. The last piece, and the most transformative piece, we would argue, is this idea of mental models. And those are the deeply held beliefs and assumptions that govern the way we operate and are sort of underlying these other conditions as they're all connected. So you'll notice the reason why we've organized this as an inverted pyramid is because each condition really kind of underlying those above them. So our mental models inform the way we engage in relationships with others. The way we think about power will influence how those dynamics manifest with others on individual levels, institutional levels, structural levels. Of course, our policies, as we see in political conversations, are kind of artifacts of our mental models, and so on. So what we're here to talk about today are relationships and connections, but we did want to contextualize that in the broader sort of scope of what we mean by systems change. So when we're talking about relationships and connections, we're talking about how we work together most effectively. And when we're building a container for work, and often we're talking about collective impact work, we want to be specific about what it really means to build durable relationships to advance systems change. So a few ideas to keep in mind to add a little more sort of rigor again to our definition here. And we're really talking about building trust and empathy, nurturing a sense of the greater whole, that is like the whole of your work and sort of the range of folks in your community, creating space for deep listening and shared vulnerability. Although it's great to be connected with you all virtually, there's no substitute for really getting in a room and hashing things out with folks. Establishing connections across lines of difference. So we'll be hearing a bit about how some communities sort of forge bonds despite some historic adversity and adversarial relationships between factions, but finding common ground obviously is key here. And then fostering a shared sense of accountability. And I think together, these conditions can help community-based efforts and broader efforts really align around a common agenda and a shared vision so that we have the sort of necessary conditions to advance a shared vision for the future and co-create that together. So it's my pleasure to sort of put a fine point on this in conversation with two dear friends of mine, Louis Bruschi, Principal Lou, and Tanisha Franks of UFT. I had the pleasure of working with them both for a year plus and continue to be a thought partner of these folks in Staten Island, New York, where FSG supported efforts around the Equity Alliance of Staten Island. So there's a lot I could say, but really impressive bios and resumes they both bring. I won't belabor the point, but I'll share a bit about them both so we have context for how fortunate we are to have both Lou and Tanisha on the line. So Lou is the founding principal of PS 78, the first Department of Ed designated community school in Staten Island, New York, and is currently in his second year as principal of Dreyfus Intermediate School 49. As a leader, he's embraced working with partners throughout Staten Island and the rest of the city. His time at both schools is layered with traditional improved outcomes around student achievement, but most notable is the way the schools have become hubs of the community by bringing resources into the schools and sharing them with the community. And again, having seen this firsthand toward sort of the early phase of collective impact efforts, I can attest to the fact that Lou doesn't know any strangers in Staten Island. He's very much a local hero, and it's a real pleasure to be here with you today, Lou. So thanks for joining us. Tanisha is a mother, committed community activist, educator, and unionist. She began her career 22 years ago in early childhood classrooms and traces her activism back to her own school experiences as early as middle school. A native to the most unknown of New York's 5 boroughs, Staten Island, she has used the close-knit relationships to foster engagement amongst community members to urge change in what is known as the borough's North Shore, where virtually all the populations people of color reside. So you have most of the folks of color in Staten Island residing in that North Shore of the borough. She wishes to create greater awareness to issues, encourage political engagement, and bolster empowerment to create equity in communities that have been historically disenfranchised through her current position with the United Federation of Teachers and the 2 community organizations that she recently founded. And I know we have you on the phone, Tanisha. Are you still with us? Can you hear us?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, excellent. Great. So from there, I, again, don't want to belabor the introductions, but so excited to elevate this story. I think it's a really great tale of how to foster relationships and connections, especially given a pretty unique context. So a few questions for you all, but before we get into sort of the process, we'd love to hear a little bit more about the context for Staten Island. It's been a flashpoint for a lot of national conversations, and as we spent time in the community with you all, we learned that there was really a process of healing and reconciliation that was sort of the backdrop for a lot of our collective impact work with you both. So before we talk about, again, the process of kind of building those relationships, we'd love to hear just, in a minute or two, your sense of the container, if you will, for that work and the backdrop through which we were kind of navigating, fostering those connections.
I'll go first, Lou. Do you mind?
Absolutely. Go ahead.
So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having us. We are residents of the borough of Staten Island in New York City, and some of the reason we have recently been in national headlines is because there's a recent incident where a encounter with police officers and community members ended up in someone's death, and that has all been brought back into the national spotlight because of some actions that just occurred with that case. The backdrop behind our racial makeup on Staten Island has a little bit to do with what I said in my bio, which is that the majority of individuals of color, populations of color, are populated in one thin section of the North Shore of Staten Island. And we're just starting to see some movement in those populations where there were times in the past where, be it because of social engineering occurrences like redlining or just people not being comfortable integrating, we've been a pretty segregated portion of New York City. So as we move away from some of those on-book types of occurrences, we definitely are working to integrate and create relationships in places where they weren't. I believe similar to some other places where you'll see dense populations of people of color that are low income as well. There are gaps in education achievement, employment. There's definitely a different type of lifestyle for different people here on Staten Island that we have been able to indicate by some of the data that we've been able to collect. So it's not just a perception, it's very real, and it's supported by data.
I think to build on what Tanisha is saying, the tragedy around the life and death of Eric Garner certainly put us on the national stage in many respects, but locally it brought a spotlight onto the inequities that were happening on Staten Island. The North Shore has been under-resourced considerably over many years through policies, through different cultural, I'll say, orientations. And because of that, the work that we've been doing over the last 5, 6, 7 years has been to kind of address those issues, but the tragedy put a spotlight on it in a different way and allowed us to take action much more concretely and intentionally. But Staten Island is a unique place in a lot of ways, or it's a small part of New York City. There are only 500,000 people. Maybe that doesn't sound small to the rest of the country, but it's a place where a lot of people know each other. Tanisha and I know each other for more than 20 years. It's a place where everybody who's doing the work kind of interacts and comes around again and again. So I'm fortunate to be able to be part of the process. I don't know if I would call it reconciliation and healing as much as it is naming, acknowledging, and addressing the work that has to happen. And Tanisha naming the gaps that exist within education. It's not just education; it's within opportunities. It's in the way people are empowered or not empowered in the borough, that we are beginning to address that work and do it, I think, intentionally and collaboratively across the community.
Powerful. Thank you so much, Lou. Really helpful to hear more about not only some of the challenges, but also the assets that Staten Island brings with the small town feel that I do enjoy every time I visit. So I want to lift up some of the bright spots that sort of sowed the foundation for the work as well. So when you think about your process of kind of building trust across lines of difference, how do you respectively kind of bring that into your practice? So we've talked about some sense of division, although there is a small town feel in your community, but what has it meant to really develop trust and keep this work at the center? And I think to name the work, I think we're really talking about developing access to opportunity and sort of closing the opportunity gap for students of color in Staten Island.
I think we start that work. Excuse me one second. I'm sorry.
The principal's job is never done.
I apologize for that.
No problem.
We started that work when I was founding principal, really opening the forum to as many people as possible. So rather than holding normal meetings, we actually used a different protocol, having everybody in a room together, sitting in a circle, giving everybody equal opportunity to talk, to share their voice, to share their story, their journey, their experience. And that became the entry point to how the work was going to be different for everyone. So I think many people look at it as a new way of doing this kind of work. Tanisha was at that first meeting, and if I remember right, she brought the cookies, which is another way to to build community. If we're able to break bread together, it makes it a little bit easier. And trust means that you're revisiting those kinds of opportunities again and again. So it's not just a one-time event, but it's built into the culture and the structure of the work that's going on. So what took place 7 years ago is still taking place in different forms in many other places now. And that's really grown the work that needed to grow.
Great.
Yes, and I would add that being able to identify people who are really committed to getting this work done, it creates connections across, if you will, silos. The very interesting thing about Lou and I is that we were actually students in education class. So you start out your career as colleagues. Lou is a principal and I am a union rep. And for those who know what that relationship means, sometimes it can put you on opposite ends of things. And the funny story about the cookies is that we actually had been in a grievance hearing that same day. And I think if anyone were to witness it, they might assume that we would walk away with like in our feelings. We definitely did what our job is and our roles. And then I came later with the cookies. And I was like, hey, well, and so we never take things personal. We have work to do. Sometimes we land on opposite ends of an issue. There are different perspectives. It's the commitment to the same goals that makes us trust each other. I never trust Lou's intentions. I know that his intentions are the same as mine, and that is the growth of students and communities. So even if we disagree on something, we definitely trust each other.
Mm-hmm. Were there any other moments for either of you, because you shared space so many times over the years, where you found any particular interventions or kinds of prompts to be helpful as you're in those conversations? Although I know cookies are a good foundation.
Yes,
sorry,
they are. They are, and I think it goes back to my original statement, which is when you know that someone is committed to the actual goals. We have shared goals, so we ask each other. We have conversations to say, if you feel like you're unsure, feel comfortable in asking if you still can count on my intentions. And, over all of these years, we found that the answer is always yes.
I think it goes back to, for me, it's reminding myself that Tanisha and I are coming from the same perspective. And that perspective is what is best for our students, what is best for our community, and how are we going to accomplish this together. Now, there are things that we can do side by side, and then there are sometimes the things that we do are on different sides, but we're on different sides of the same circle, and we're doing the work in that circle. And I take value in that we're able to do that work together from different points, and that's how I look at the work with a lot of different partners that we have the opportunity to work with. It's where we all have our hands in this work, and we could do what we can do from the places we're standing in it. And Tanisha's always been a critical partner in that, and a valuable partner. Yeah,
that's great. So you've touched on this in a few ways, but I want to go a little deeper on how this plays a role in your leadership styles, respectively. Obviously, you've both cultivated a particular kind of leadership in your community and the institutions you've worked through. But when you think about fostering relationships and connections in your context, how do you think about sort of practically building that into your practice as a leader?
I think first, it's critical to get to know the people that you're working with and understand what drives them, what motivates them, and for people who are already in positions of power and prominence, that's kind of easy. If you're an executive director in an organization, or if you're a leader in an organization, your work kind of speaks to what your values are and how you function. But more importantly was having what appears to be casual conversations with more people in the community, and trying to understand what drives them, figuring out what assets they bring to the work or potentially could bring to the work, and then giving them opportunities to exercise those strengths in the work in a very real way, kind of leaving it off. If I called it delegating, that means that I had the ability to do it. But these are people who have ability far beyond my capacity to lead the work in different areas. And having those real conversations early on allows me to get the best sense of where that work could happen, and then I help facilitate that as much as possible with as many people as possible. So I do one thing really well, and I think there are a lot of people who do one thing really well, and as long as we're doing different things together to impact the same work, then a potential partner is right there with me. But those early conversations, those real conversations, might be dinner, might be a cookie, might be something even easier or more impactful, but you get to know people in a real way. That's what makes a difference.
Yeah, and having broken bread with you before, I can attest to the power of meals with Principal Lou. Tanisha, anything you'd add about your leadership style?
I think the importance for me, what I have learned is to be a role model. Sometimes that means going a little harder than others just to show some of the work, we find that we end up with some of the drop-off. Drop-off is like a big deal because what we're having a conversation about is very vast, and it doesn't have a lot of structure sometimes, and sometimes people revert back to what they know in terms of getting work done and workflow, and sometimes it's out the commitment. And so if I said that I was going to commit to this work, as a leader, I have to make sure that I do that and make it so that I can try to figure out what it is that might be holding people in different spaces. So listening also is important, and being open to the answers.
Right. So before we transition to the next part of the conversation, one last question for you both. Maybe we can address these relatively quickly. But obviously, the intent here is to deepen relationships and connections so we can really get closer to achieving our shared goals and kind of moving our process toward outcomes. So as you reflect on the work in Staten Island, are there any lessons learned that you'd leave folks with for now as you think about building relationships toward the kind of shared goals you have?
If I could start off, early on, I thought all of our partners would be local, and there would have to be people kind of embedded and invested in the community structurally from the get-go, even historically. But increasingly, I've come to realize that the strength has to be growing the work and becoming, I think, a little bit more of a hybrid of people with experiences inside Staten Island and successful journeys outside of Staten Island, and help to bring those journeys to bear on the work that we're doing. And as Tanisha said, that listening component becomes critical, because once you can begin to identify partners who have been on similar journeys elsewhere, it begins to open up the possibilities for the work we need to do here.
That's great. Thanks. Anything you'd add, Tanisha?
There's been so many lessons. It's super important to really, the connections that we talked about, and just to be very honest, not really worry about it. Just you have to just really be all in and not worry about you move, because you're at work, but you still want to move in a space where you're pushing through some tough spots. And sometimes when we're at work, we stay in a place of comfort. And so if we're trying to change systems, we have to be able to accept that some of those conversations are going to be tough, and the commitment is going to be tough. You're not going to get an entire system to change by staying in that place where sometimes we get into when we're doing different type of labor. It's a different. So, when we started early on, we definitely thought about some of the preliminary work that we would need to do on ourselves, and I think that we were really prepared. Things like check-ins and self-care and being able to be honest with each other. So, the lesson is just to really trust the process and to just keep moving. And very proud of what we've been able to accomplish in that way.
That's great. Thank you. And it reminds me of a quote I think we shared on a prior webinar, which is the success of a systems intervention really depends on the interior condition of the intervener. And it sounds like both of you have really brought a reflective practice in your work so that you're thinking about how you show up as you enter in conversations with others. It's really important to think about that kind of inside-out approach. So more to come. We'll have an opportunity to field some questions from the audience later in the call. But for now, I wanted to pass the baton to Kim, who will lead the next portion of the conversation.
Thank you, Hayling, and thanks to that great discussion with Lou and Tanisha. That was really interesting. I'm Kim Syman from New Profit, and New Profit is a nonprofit venture philanthropy fund that has been focused for the past 20 years on supporting breakthrough social entrepreneurs to address pressing social problems in the U.S. most people think about social entrepreneurs in a fairly narrow sense related to scaling a practice in some fashion, but social entrepreneurs that we've partnered with really since the beginning have been thinking about systems change, and we've been working increasingly with a set of highly entrepreneurial leaders that are focused exclusively on systems change, not necessarily scaling a practice at all as the center of their work. In that context, it's been fantastic for me to get to know Gerry Roll over the past few years. Gerry is the executive director of the Foundation for Appalachian Kentucky, a community development foundation that's committed to building community capacity and locally controlled assets in southeastern Kentucky. They're focused on animating the principles of rural development philanthropy in their work, which has three key areas: early childhood education, access to healthcare, and the one that we're going to focus on today, which is equity and housing. Before I turn it over to Gerry, I want to introduce Scott McReynolds, who is a partner of Gerry's, and you can see they're even sitting together, which is a nice aspect of the relationship part of the conversation. You can see their dynamics, not just hear them talk. Scott is the executive director of the Housing Development Alliance, who's worked in the area of rehabilitation and the construction of affordable housing in Eastern Kentucky since 1992. The Housing Alliance has grown from a staff of 1 to 30, which is really large for that area, and has completed over 280 home ownership units, 700 repairs for low-income household homeowners, and developed 36 rental units, and has lots more in the works. I'd like to invite them to introduce their work and get really concrete. What problem are you trying to solve? And then I want to hear a little bit about the context. I thought that was really helpful surround that we got from Tanisha and Lou in our earlier discussion. So I'd like you to start, Scott. What problem are you trying to solve with the Housing Development Alliance? And tell us a little bit about the context of the work.
So the mission of the Housing Development Alliance is to use the power of housing to transform lives and to build a brighter future for the community. And I think to understand that, you really have to start with the context. Our service area, our 4 counties, are among the poorest in the nation. We're persistent poverty counties. We've been poor since they started counting persistent poverty. We've always been high poverty, high need area. And so we're really trying to, even though we're a housing agency, our focus is really to try to bring about that economic change and so to help people succeed. We do that through homeownership, homeowner rehab, and, as you say, the rental development.
And Gerry, talk a little bit about what problem you're trying to solve when it comes to housing and the way you look at your context. Obviously, you're in the same place, so but from the standpoint of creating the Foundation for Appalachian Kentucky, what was the impetus that addresses your context?
So the Foundation for Appalachian Kentucky is a community development foundation, so we're not like your granddaddy's community foundation. We started our work probably about 15 years ago, actually launched about 10 years ago, but our entire purpose has been around trying to change the way that capital flows and investments are made in marginalized communities, and especially in rural, persistent poverty places like ours. And for us, that means, we're always, as Scott described, we're in a persistent poverty region. Our footprint covers a region that has more than 1 million people almost 1 million people in it. We're declining a little bit. 1 million people, that's more than Louisville, more than Lexington, more than Louisville and Lexington combined if you're looking at the big urban centers in Kentucky, but yet we're the most, the poorest and the least healthy. So our work is around changing the way capital and investments are made here. Even though a lot of money's been dumped here, there's never been really any smart investment. So we do that with organizing communities, building and providing some tools for the capacity in those communities, and then controlling local assets and using those local assets to channel and leverage additional assets from outside our own region, but creating that civic engagement that gets to making those investments the right way. The way we look at that in equitable housing is that means housing is always at the center of the conversation, that no matter what we happen to be talking about in a community, housing is at the table because it's part of this bigger picture that we are developing. And I know there's other questions, and we'll get more into that, but we see equitable housing as one of the top priorities for our region, and for investing and creating the space. Scott will use his bowl analogy, so I won't take it away from him, for families and communities to thrive and be healthy.
So, Scott, tell us what role the Foundation for Appalachian Kentucky plays in your ability to do your work. And then I want to hear what your relationship with Gerry specifically enables.
So, I mean, on the very basic level, the foundation is one of our funders. And, we've received money from their geographic component fund, a donor advised fund, their pooled investment fund. And one of the great things about the local money is it doesn't come with a prescription about this is how you have to spend it, in terms of, we spend a lot of time taking urban housing programs and trying to make them work in rural places. So it's always great to get money that kind of understands rural to begin with. Beyond that initial funding, I think one of the things that the foundation, and particularly Gerry, has done for us has been a connector to other deeper pockets, some of the capital outside of the region, whether it's a regional foundation or a national foundation. The ability to we're busy building houses, so I don't really have the time to go to New York City and talk to this foundation or that foundation. And so Gerry can kind of fill that role and connect us to that. And it's actually led to close to $1 million worth of investment in our organization in the last couple of years from these different foundations that we've been connected with. And I think part of that connecting is Gerry can be a real advocate for us, in that I think often when people, they think that our challenges are just some kind of technical. We just don't know how to use capital. And the reality is, of course, we can get technically better. We can always learn to be a little more efficient. There's always a new idea out there. But really, we're dealing with broken markets, and that takes deep subsidy. If you're going to rebuild a housing market, it's not going to be a technical fix. It's going to be a real deep subsidy. And I can say that all day long, and I think it's always, the foundations tend to say, oh, well, you just don't know what you're doing. But when you have a partner that's respected like Gerry that's talking about broken markets and the need for subsidy, I think it goes a long way. And then I think on a local level, it's been interesting participating in the foundation and the various kind of bringing the community together events to talk about what's really needed, has really helped us develop different partners in the community than we maybe had before. Having Gerry and the foundation engaging in this bigger conversation about what the vision for the future is has really been I think they've been a real strong thought partner for us, and really helped us develop an understanding of how our work fits in that broader revitalization of our community.
So, Gerry, I'd like to hear you reflect on how you see Scott and the work of the Housing Development Alliance, how that enables you to get done what you're trying to get done. And then I'll come back and invite both of you to reflect on the relationship itself. But first, let's just hear a little more about how it works. What do you do?
First, I would say for everybody listening, we're a foundation, but we started 10 years ago with $5,000 and a Women of Prayer. So when Scott says it's resulted in $1 million of additional investment into his work, it's not because we have a big benefactor or a big foundation out there that's pouring money in here and we're just re-granting it out. No, we have busted our collective asses to get out there and say, this work is happening and it's happening well. Sorry about that. And what Scott is saying is true. He's saying, well, Gerry gets out there and does this or Gerry does that. It's really about this foundation and the power of bringing communities together, organizing them, and then organizing those communities into a network of communities that are all talking to each other and then saying, hey, housing is important to us too. Why are all of us dying earlier than everybody else in the rest of the United States? Well, it's because our housing stock is awful, and because our schools suck, and because all of these, other things that are going on. So the way that relates to my work is I can use my voice, but my voice is meaningless unless this work is actually happening out here on the ground in these communities. So if I go to Boston or I go to DC or go to a gathering and I'm up at the microphone and my voice is quivering and saying, but it doesn't work that way where I live, and somebody comes up to me and says, well, tell me more, I want to see. If I can't bring those folks here and put them in front of Scott and watch him wax poetic about what's really going on in the housing market, then none of it matters. So what I am here to do is to just, our foundation, when I say I use that I and we a lot, but when I say that, I mean, what we have developed, being this rural hub and this channel, money flows where there's a channel for it to come through. And if the channel gets there and there's nothing for it to do, it's just going to stop. But when the work is actually happening on the ground and we can get that out there, and then people in this community can say, yeah, invest in housing, that's really important, but those kids have to get up every day and go to school. So we need to invest in that too, or these parents need to work. Where's our child care going to come from? So my relationship to all of these other partners and players, whether they're donors or workers or just folks who come in to grab a banana and tell us what they really think ought to be happening, my relationship to that is just to give them that voice and to say to the bigger world, there's a lot of really good stuff going on here, but we need to think differently about how we're making those big investments. And if you don't want your money to go to waste, then you need to come down here and get it as close to the ground as you can possibly get it. And this is the way we can do that in rural America or in any other marginalized community. I believe that.
So what, I'll pose this to Scott first and then back to Gerry. What makes your relationship effective? We heard some from Tanisha and Lou about some of the attributes of their relationship and how they work together that makes it powerful. What would you say those are for you?
So I think there's got to be a huge amount of trust, and there is. But I think if you're going to have an effective relationship, you have to have trust, and that's developed, just from knowing people and eating cookies, as they said, or having a meal together, or having children that you talk about that kind of trust. But it's really critical, because I mentioned like the how Gerry has helped connect us to other funders. There's a point in time where it almost seemed like Gerry was getting money for what I was doing, but we had this trust in this bigger vision, and that's really come to fruition. So I think you have to have trust, and you have to be in it for the long haul. We're very honest with each other, which I think is critical. There's times that I'm thinking about something the wrong way, and Gerry will say, hey, you're not thinking about that. Or you're being, you're too much about yourself, not enough about the community or what have you. So I think trust and honesty are probably, I wasn't going to say that. I think it's important the trust and honesty are probably the two fundamental things I think you need to develop.
Yeah. Gerry, what would you add?
I can't add that enough. It's trust. We came at this from, as Scott alluded to earlier, generations of scarcity. And we can talk about collective impact and backbone organizations and all the fancy work on everybody's website. But the fact is, when you're in a community like ours where resources are scarce and need is high, trust is slim. And so when a group of people emerges and says, we want to create this vehicle so that we can attract more resources for everybody. But to start, we got to put some resources into this vehicle. There's a lot of skepticism. And so that trust is just really, really important. And then I think being able to share that trust. Scott extends his trust in me to others that I may not know yet, or others that may be in the room that don't quite trust me as much, and I do the same for him. But also knowing that we aren't always going to agree, and I heard that earlier. it's not always kumbaya and happiness around here. But the fact is, we are holding a bigger, broader vision of a healthier community where people want to live and raise their family. And it's hard, and it takes a long time, and it's a slog. And we just have to trust that we're all working towards that. And today may be his day with the big thunder, but in a month it may be somebody else's day with a big thunder. And now we can all look back, 10 years ago and look at today. And I had somebody walk into my office today and that said, I heard the animal shelter's water pump went out. I want to pay that bill. Can you just find out what it is so we can send them some money? That's totally off the wall. Doesn't mean anything, but it could have been, I want to leave my entire 7-figure estate to a housing organization. Do you know one? And that's what we've created across this region by creating this hub. And it's just a different way for money and resources to direct and to be invested, but it's that trust among all of us and that connectiveness that we know, that Scott knows, that the child care and the schools are just as important as the housing, and we have to give all of those equal measures.
So one quick follow-up question on that to you, Scott. You and Gerry and your organizations are partners, and Gerry is also a funder. And one of the things that we know is that funding relationships can be notoriously challenging to build trust in and to have the kind of vulnerability that trust requires and also makes possible. Can you talk a little bit about what in your relationship with Gerry makes it possible for you to have that kind of trust or vulnerability, if that's the right word for you, in a context where you're also a funding recipient?
I think some of that comes from just having, it's the longevity of the relationship, I think definitely helps. Because I don't worry about, I'm going to say the wrong thing and Gerry's going to decide we don't need that money or we're not doing the right thing and try to take it away. And I think with, I was dealing with a funder yesterday and they were asking questions and I was really being very careful how I answered because I didn't want to mislead, but also, I wanted to say what I thought they wanted. And it's interesting that you asked that question because I don't think about the foundation in that way. I feel like I can come into Gerry's office and say, here's what's going on, and I don't have to spin it. It's not and I think that just goes back to the fact that we live and work in the same community, and that we have worked together for so long.
Yeah. So I feel like
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Gerry.
Well, I would say that absolutely it's that groundedness, it's being here, and knowing, Scott can tell me whatever he wants, but I'm going to see him at the Food City. I'm going to drive by the housing project, the work that he's doing. I'm going to know the people on his construction crew, so he can tell me whatever he wants to do, but I'm going to know what's really going on. And it's vice versa. See, I've been on the other side too. I'm also a grant recipient, so I know how that feels and what that's like. And I think that Scott or any of our grantee partners know that. And we also consider our grantee partners, not grantees, because it's that work that matters. How much money I have or how much money we put out the door is not what's important. What's important is what's happening when that hits the ground. And if I'm right here on the ground with them, along with the other people that work here, plus our donors trust that I'm right here on the ground with them. They may not be here, but they know I'm here. That accountability goes both ways.
Thank you. Thank you both. Hayling, over to you for Q&A.
Thank you, Kim. Really great to hear about the different application of this work. So talking about first kind of the education and youth development side, how you build trust toward shared goals, and then housing and sort of community finance, philanthropy, how that shows up. Thank you all for sharing those perspectives. So we've gotten a few questions from the audience, and I'll pose these to the group broadly, and folks can feel free to jump in as they see fit. For starters, how do power dynamics between stakeholders affect sort of the building of relationships, and in particular sort of issues around conflict resolution? And I'm just reflecting on, again, the mix of formal and informal authority that people have. So it might be someone running a foundation. It might be someone who we know represents the voice of parents or grantees in a community in a less formal capacity. But how do the power dynamics sort of accelerate or inhibit your ability to sort of broker trust?
If it's okay, if I start off with that one, the accessibility issue becomes critical. People having access to exercise their voice, as well as access to those who are in power. That became a critical early move that had to be made. So opening up that forum to give everybody equal placement, equal seat, equal footing, equal voice, that was critical. And then people of power have to be available in the community in ways that kind of remove some of those cloaks of power that are attached to them. So instead of being in the office, being on a street corner, being at the stoop, being in a pizzeria, those are things that begin to change those structures, those power dynamics. I don't need to really rely on a cookie for so much, but and I didn't know I was going to go in this direction today, but I actually asked Tanisha to bring the cookies that day because I didn't have cookies. There was a person who had dietary restrictions. I didn't have the right food for this person. Tanisha was a go-to at that point. I was vulnerable to her in that situation, and she came through. And I think that's an example of how you kind of cede some of that power and bring other people to the table to support the work that has to be done, regardless of what the power structure is. And that was valuable. You know, I knew Tanisha was a friend long before that, but that kind of cemented the work. I was new in the principalship, and she was happy to take care of something that needed to be taken care of to move the whole agenda forward, you know, for both our parts. So that power structure piece is critical, and demonstrating ceding that power is just as critical.
And I would just add, I can't stress the cookie thing enough. We prefer pound cake, but I think often for us, and we're in a really controversial. We can get some really tough conversations going here around the energy and coal and housing and poor people and wealthy people and all that. We often we don't claim to be a neutral facilitator, but we do claim to be even-handed. Sometimes that's not enough. So we will actually not just buy the pound cake, but we will bring in a neutral facilitator to help us facilitate a complicated conversation among partners or among donors and insiders, outsiders, however people see the conflict. We will bring in a facilitator, a trained facilitator to help us host that conversation. We've done that lots of times, and we've always had really good results. And then I think that goes to build the trust in us that we don't say, oh, we can be neutral, because sometimes we can't, but we can bring somebody in who is, and we're willing to do that and be wrong if we end up being wrong.
That's great. Anything you would add, Tanisha? I know you wear a few hats as a teacher with credibility, but also as someone from the teachers union who's plugged into the establishment. I'm wondering how you navigate power dynamics and how they've helped you build trust.
I think for me, everything that has already been said is super important. I've also learned a lot about just being in the world and how we perceive power as well, and how you really have to be familiar with different aspects of people's perspectives and lives. What Lou has pointed out in regards to removing yourself from the principal's office is a loaded space for many people, and so and I, as evidence of Lou's ability to do that, I have a workshop with educators, and I take them through purposefully being in a school environment and what it's like to enter the school day, because for a lot of us, that is a power situation, especially in marginalized populations where any building that's institutionalized comes with its already it has a feeling already. Like, I belong in this space, you belong in that space. And so when Lou says that he removes himself from the principal office and puts himself in a pizzeria, that's a big thing. And what Gerry said about bringing other people in, because what we've learned going back to the lessons questions is that a lot of times we assume we already know what people need. And if you don't ask them actually what they do in fact need, you might be barking up the wrong tree. So having different perspectives come in is very important with those power struggles, because we could all anchor in our positions and where we perceive the work should begin and not move ever.
Thank you. So we're running up on time, so maybe in a minute or so each would welcome closing thoughts, and maybe around this lens in particular. So there's a question around how we might build relationships across organizations. We're hearing a lot about individual connections, and of course we can serve as ambassadors for organizations, but on the institutional level, are there ways you've been able to be more intentional about brokering those relationships?
For us, that's what we do. So I can't, we aren't in a particular sector. We're in the business, to use the collective impact language, the backbone business or the anchor organization business or the system business. So building relationships, we're not co-located, but we don't mind getting up and going around in somewhere. We drive a lot because we're covering a lot of vertical land around here. But I think just being willing to get up and go or pick up the phone sometimes. And I know social, this technology stuff is really important, and I'm old, but there's a lot to be said for just being willing to show up and be in a space in person, and living in a place and doing the work there is way different from living somewhere 100 miles away and trying to do work in a place.
Yeah.
I could add.
Go ahead.
Thank you. If I could add very briefly, just being courageous within your own institution. I think we haven't really spoke about that. You did mention the individual, and so sometimes you come back into a space where you haven't had your counterpart in your space experience what you've experienced, and sometimes you have to come back and be authentic, and you have to let people know, like, it might be something that we've actually believed that's holding certain things in place. When we talk about the mental models, if we're going to, a lot of us are moving as individuals through mental models, but if we're going to really impact institutions, those of us that are engaged in the work have to go back to our own and be courageous in the conversations that we have internally.
And a good reminder that these conditions are connected. I remember we were troubleshooting a challenge in your office, Tanisha, and you actually pulled out the inverted triangle and talked about sort of the way those things were interacting. I thought it was a really cool application of that. So I think a really helpful closing note that as we seek to foster deeper connections and relationships across our organizations and as individuals, it's important to be mindful of the power dynamics that can serve as a minefield in those dynamics, and also be aware of our own mental models as we kind of encounter the mental models of others. So really thoughtful note to end on. Thank you all for the rich perspective. It's been a real joy to hear from you all about the work, and hopefully folks on the phone gleaned as much as well. I'll pass it along to Jen to close this out.
I was just going to offer Kim if you'd like to share any closing words on behalf of New Profit as well.
Sure. Thanks, everyone. I really enjoyed the chance to hear from all four of our partners, and I wanted to offer one reflection on building trust and relationship in a context where you don't get to work together in a geographically proximate way, at least on a regular basis. And that has to do with actually taking time to talk by phone or video call, but to really listen, to reflect back what you're hearing, to do everything you can to close that gap by the sort of intentionality of focus in a conversation. And I don't think it's a total substitution for in-person and proximate connection, but it can really go a long way in this world where we have to figure out how to work across greater distances. I think that there are a lot of the same things that I've heard from Lou and Tanisha and Scott and Gerry can be applied in remote communication as well. Thanks again to all.
Thank you all. And on behalf of New Profit, FSG, and the Collective Impact Forum, I just want to thank everybody for joining today. We will be sharing a recording for those who are interested. And finally, if you are interested in further in-person learning opportunities, I just wanted to let everyone know about an opportunity that the Collective Impact Forum will be hosting in Pittsburgh later this year. Information is here on the screen, and we encourage you to check it out if you'd like to continue these types of conversations in person. So thank you all and have a great day.
Thank you.
All
Thanks,
right.
everybody.
Bye.